I'm reading from various passages in John chapter 11. Now a man named Lazarus was sick. He was from Bethany, the village of Mary and her sister Martha. So the sisters sent word to Jesus, "Lord, the one you love is sick." When he heard this, Jesus said, "This sickness will not end in death. No, it is for God's glory, so that God's Son may be glorified through it." Jesus loved Martha and her sister and Lazarus. Yet when he heard that Lazarus was sick, he stayed where he was for 2 more days. Then he said to the disciples, "Let us go back to Judea." On his arrival, Jesus found that Lazarus had already been in the tomb for 4 days. Bethany was less than 3 kilometers from Jerusalem, and many Jews had come to Martha and Mary to comfort them in the loss of their brother. When Martha heard that Jesus was coming, she went out to meet him, but Mary stayed at home. "Lord," Martha said to Jesus, "if you had been here, my brother would not have died. But I know that even now God will give you whatever you ask." Jesus said to her, "Your brother will rise again." Martha answered, "I know he will rise again in the resurrection at the last day." Jesus said to her, "I am the resurrection and the life. He who believes in me will live, even though he dies. And whoever lives and believes in me will never die. Do you believe this?" "Yes, Lord," she told him. "I believe that you are the Christ, the Son of God, who has come into this world." When Mary reached the place where Jesus was and saw him, she fell at his feet and said, "Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died." When Jesus saw her weeping, and the Jews who had come along with her also weeping, he was deeply moved in spirit and troubled. "Where have you laid him?" he asked. "Come and see, Lord," they replied. Jesus wept. Then the Jews said, "See how he loved him." But some of them said, "Could not he who opened the eyes of the blind man have kept this man from dying?" Thanks be to God for his word.
Thank you, Chris. Well, today's the final week in our 3-week series in which we've been asking some questions about God. We've been asking some questions about what God is like. And today we are considering this question: is God cold-hearted? Is God cold-hearted? Perhaps another way of expressing that is to ask, does God care? Now, the first thing we need to acknowledge about this question is that the question of whether God is or is not cold-hearted is it's not a question which arises in seminary classrooms. This is not a question which comes up as part of a systematic exploration of who God is or as part of a correspondence course in theology. No, that's not how this question arises. This question of whether God is cold-hearted arises not so much as a question of the mind, as much as it arises as a cry from the heart. It's a question which emerges from the depths of your being when your marriage ends, or when you are made redundant at work. It's a question which emerges from your deep experience of life when you discover that your child is in the grip of an addiction, or when you receive that diagnosis, or when the fog of depression just refuses to lift? And it's a question that is most likely to emerge when you receive not one of these blows, but a double blow, or even a triple blow, when in the short space of life it seems like all the wind is knocked out of your lungs by the sense of being on the wrong side of fate. And you begin to ask deep questions about the heart of God. Sometimes the question of whether God is cold-hearted arises not so much from your own experience of life as it does from your own heart being broken by the suffering of other people. A doctor who serves the impoverished community of Diepsloot recounts the overwhelming challenges that the people of that community face. Not even in trying to escape the grinding poverty they are in, but even just to survive in the midst of that poverty. And it seems that at every turn there is a roadblock, stopping them from experiencing an abundance of life. And one tries to imagine what it must be like to be born in that situation, and your heart breaks and you begin to ask questions about God's heart. C.S. Lewis, who many of you will probably know as the author of the Chronicles of Narnia, he wrote his memoirs in a book called Surprised by Joy. Up until the time that he wrote his book, C.S. Lewis had been a confirmed bachelor. And at the age of 57 years, he met the woman that turned his world upside down, that filled his life with joy. And her name was Joy, and hence the title of the book was called Surprised by Joy. And after C.S. Lewis had published this book, he married Joy, and she was the joy of his life. And then after what seemed like a lifetime of waiting for this precious gift, he was given just 2 years of happiness with her. And then she gets cancer. She dies a horrible, painful death. And in the midst of his grief, C.S. Lewis writes another book. And this book is called A Grief Observed. And this is a book which explores that question that we ask, does God care? I want to read to you a passage from that book. Those of you who are at the Friday afternoon remembrance service might remember it from then. He writes, when you are happy, so happy you have no sense of needing God, so happy you are tempted to feel His claims upon you as an interruption. If you remember yourself and turn to Him with gratitude and praise, you will be, or so it feels, welcomed with open arms. But go to Him when your need is desperate, when all other help is in vain, and what do you find? A door slammed in your face, and a sound of bolting and double bolting on the inside. And after that, silence. You may as well turn away. The longer you wait, the more emphatic the silence will become. And then he goes on to say, what can this mean? Why is God so present a commander in our times of prosperity and so very absent a help in times of trouble? That question that C.S. Lewis asks can be stated in another way. Is God cold-hearted? Does God care? Does God care about what's going on in your life? Is God involved in what is going on in your life? Or did He, millions of years ago, just sort of kickstart the universe and then leave us to fend for ourselves? Because sometimes that's what it can feel like. Now, some of us were raised to believe that to ask a question like, is God cold-hearted, is impertinent. It's wrong. In fact, it might even attract bad things to come into our lives from God. But the Bible is full of stories of women and men of faith who, in the depths of the despair, asked, difficult and probing questions about the nature of God. One of Israel's most beloved kings, King David, he was described as a man after God's own heart, yet in his own challenges, he wrestled with this question of whether God is cold-hearted. You can read about his struggle in Psalm 13. And in Psalm 13, he writes, "How long, Lord, will you forget me forever? How long will you hide your face from me?" And when he asks how long, he's really asking how much longer. David has been praying and praying. He's been hoping and hoping. He's been waiting and waiting for God to show up. And all he has experienced, it seems, is that door slammed in his face, the sound of bolting and double bolting on the inside, and then silence. Maybe you've been in a place like that. Maybe you find yourself in a place like that right now. Maybe you remember a time when you felt that God was so close to you, that he was there for you, but now you're not so sure. Maybe you've been praying not just for days and days or weeks and weeks or for months, but for years. And it just doesn't seem like God is going to answer you. Does God care? Is God cold-hearted? Our reading today is a reading which considers this question. It tells the story of three siblings, Martha and Mary and Lazarus. And something happens in their family that challenges what they had previously believed to be true about Jesus. Something which shakes the very foundation of their faith. And it leaves them wondering, God, where are you? God, where were you? God, why did you let this happen? God, do you care? And the story begins, as many gospel stories do. It begins with someone asking Jesus for help. But there's something different about this story. For the people who ask Jesus for help, they're not just anybody. This is not somebody in the crowd or somebody on the curb, on the roadside as Jesus walks past. This is not a stranger's request, a request from a random person. Jesus knows this family. Jesus knows this family well. For Martha, Mary, and Lazarus lived just 3 kilometers outside of the walls of Jerusalem. And whenever Jesus travels down from rural Galilee to Jerusalem, he would stay with this family. This home was Jesus' home from home. It was his Jerusalem headquarters, if you like. These people were like family to Jesus. They have shared meals together, they've laughed together, they've probably cried together. This is a family in whose home Jesus has found refuge and friendship. Jesus is such close friends with Lazarus and Martha and Mary that they don't even have to mention their names when they send the message to Jesus. The message says simply, "The one you love is sick." And the phrase could be translated, "Your dear friend or your best friend is sick." Now, I don't know about you, but for most of us, I think when we receive a cry of help from somebody that we care about, I think you'd probably agree with me that the thing that you do in those circumstances is that you just drop everything and you go. And that becomes your first priority. When that call of distress is from somebody that's close to you, you don't first finish watching that movie on Netflix. You don't first go and do the shopping or go to the gym, but you drop everything and you show up. And yet the details of the story are very intriguing. John writes this. He writes in verse 5, "Now Jesus loved Martha and her sister and Lazarus." And then in verse 6, it really seems to suggest the opposite of what we'd expect. For we read in verse 6, "So when he heard that Lazarus was sick, he stayed where he was 2 more days." I mean, isn't that strange? And then he said to his disciples, "Let us go back to Judea," which was the province that Bethany and Jerusalem are in. I mean, isn't this strange? Jesus hears of this family's emergency. He cares about this family. This isn't just any family. And then he basically does nothing about it. John gives no explanation as to Jesus being busy with something else. He doesn't tell us that Jesus was busy helping somebody else or that Jesus was busy in an important meeting. In fact, Jesus doesn't just wait. He waits until he knows that Lazarus is dead. It's very interesting that in Hebrew, the word Lazarus means God is my help. But at this point in the story, it looks like the very opposite. At this point in the story, it looks like God hasn't helped. It looks like maybe God couldn't help, that God didn't help. And Gospel writer John makes it very clear in the story that Jesus' delay created a crisis of faith for more than one person in the story. It created a crisis of faith for Martha. On hearing that Jesus is finally en route to her house, she goes out to meet him. And when she reaches him on the road, she greets him with these words. She says, Lord, if you had been there, my brother would not have died. And then Martha returns to the house to call Mary, and then the two of them return to Jesus. They meet him on the road again, and in verse 32 we read that when Mary reached the place where Jesus was and saw him, she fell at his feet. Listen again to what she said. Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died. And again, Mary is expressing her disappointment at Jesus' apparently nonchalant response to the news of Lazarus' illness. And so the group of travelers then moves on to Bethany, to the home that is filled with mourners. And John tells us that the response of some of the mourners to Jesus' arrival was this, that some of them asked this question, could not he who opened the eyes of the blind man have kept this man from dying? And so 3 times John records for us that this question was asked of Jesus, and each time it's really another way of asking the question, is Jesus uncaring? Could things have turned out different if Jesus had come sooner? Or rather, why couldn't Jesus have come sooner so that things could have turned out differently? And friends, isn't this often the question that we ask of God? Behind the question, is God cold-hearted? We've got a fixed understanding of how God should work in our situation. We want to define how God works, and when God's ways are not our ways, we find ourselves questioning the very nature of God, questioning God's very heart. Now, I want to say to you that if you've ever found yourself questioning God's ways or questioning God's heart, questioning whether God cares for you or cares for people that you see stuck in suffering, this morning I want to point you to 2 truths that come to us from this passage. 2 truths that can help us to make sense of God when God seems to be silent, when God seems to be inactive, when God seems to be slow to respond to our cries of help. Now, the first truth that John wants us to know when he tells us the story is that Jesus feels our pain deeply. Jesus feels our pain deeply. Listen to verse 33. When Jesus saw Mary weeping, he was deeply moved in spirit and troubled. And then Jesus asks to be taken to Lazarus' lifeless body. And on seeing it, we read in verse 35, the shortest verse in the Bible, the words, Jesus wept. Jesus wept. And because John doesn't want us to miss this short sentence, he invites us to respond to Jesus' weeping through the eyes of the other mourners. John tells us in verse 36 that the mourners whispered in each other's ears. They said, "See how he loved him." Our scholars point out that Jesus' weeping, it would not have been a silent little cry into his hanky so that nobody would see. that the word translated wept is the same word which refers to a horse's loud snorting. I'm not going to try and imitate that sound for you right now. That in keeping with the custom of the time, Jesus would have been wailing loud cries of sorrow. And William Barclay points out what a radical thing it was for John to describe Jesus as being deeply moved, Jesus as being troubled, Jesus as weeping. Some background to John's gospel is that John's gospel was written to Greek Christians rather than to Jewish Christians. And for a Greek who had grown up worshiping the Greek gods and goddesses, who had been schooled in Stoic philosophy, the idea of God weeping, it would be a shock. It would be an incredible idea for them to get their heads around. John has written his whole gospel on the theme that in Jesus we see the mind of God. We see who God is. And to the Greek, the primary characteristic of God was described in the Greek word apatheia, which means a total inability to feel any emotion whatsoever. And the thinking of the Greek Stoics went like this. It said, if you and I can feel sorrow or joy or gladness or grief, it means that something can affect us. Something has power over us in that moment in which we are moved to feel this or that emotion. They then reason to say, well, nobody can have any power over God, and therefore God is essentially incapable of feeling any emotion whatsoever. The Greeks believed in an isolated, a passionless, a compassionless God, a God who was stoic but cold-hearted. And here is John telling those that he writes to that the God revealed in Jesus is anything but cold-hearted. Jesus shows us a God whose heart is wrung with anguish for the anguish of his people. And the greatest thing that Jesus did was to bring us the news of a God who cares. And at the heart of this gospel is the belief that God cared enough about suffering creation, that he cared enough to come down in human form. The Creator becomes one with his suffering creation. The Creator shares in the suffering of his creation. For God so loved the world. Remember, John is written early on in John 3. For God so loved the world that he sent his only begotten Son. And so in the story we are reminded, friends, that God is the God who is with us, that God is the God who feels with us, that God is the God who weeps with us, that God's heart is soft towards us. God shares in our pain. And this knowledge that God is alongside of us in our pain, it sustains us, and it strengthens us, and it keeps us going. The second truth that John wants us to grasp in this passage is the truth that there is a life beyond this one, which puts the experience of this life into perspective. There is a life beyond this life, which puts this life into perspective. So here's Martha. Her world is shaken. For 2 long days and probably 2 nights as well, her mind and heart have been spinning with questions of why Jesus didn't show up and why Jesus chose to delay his arrival, or what could be more important than his best friend's survival. Why Jesus hadn't stepped in to heal her brother as he had done for so many others. She's looking for answers, and she expresses her questions to Jesus, and Jesus meets her in her place of questioning. And he says to her, your brother will rise again. And Martha kind of shifts back into theological mode, which is what people often do in the midst of their grief. And she says, okay, I know that Lazarus will rise again in the resurrection at that last day. In other words, she says, I know that there will be a day when God will do what God says he'll do. She's saying to Jesus, I know the promises. I'm a faithful first century Jew. I understand the future that God is moving creation towards. And Jesus responds to Martha and he says, no. He interrupts her and he says to her, your theology is right, but it's missing something really important. And then he says these words that no other first century rabbi would dare to say. He says to Martha, I am the resurrection and the life. The one who believes in me will live even though they die. And whoever lives by believing in me will never die. In other words, Jesus is saying to Martha, he's saying, Martha, there's a kind of life that even death cannot touch. There's a kind of life that is available through me, Martha. There's a kind of life that is found, it's not found in life going smoothly. It's not found when I answer all of your prayers and deliver you from all suffering. There is a kind of life that is discovered in discovering who I am, says Jesus. And Jesus uses this phrase, I am the resurrection. And that's a reference to the way that God spoke about himself in the Old Testament. God said, I am who I am. And here he says, I am the resurrection and the life. And so Jesus is saying to Martha, as he says to us today, he says to Martha, I'm more than just a teacher. I didn't just come to improve your circumstances or to make you feel better about this life for just a moment. He's saying, my mission is much bigger, Martha, than you could ever imagine. I came to conquer sin. I came to conquer death. I came to give you hope that transcends every and any circumstance you may have. I have come to transform all of creation. And then Jesus asks Martha, he invites Martha to see through her grief to his cosmic plan. And he asks her a very powerful question. Having said, I am the resurrection and the life, he says to Martha, do you believe this? Do you believe this? Do you believe who I am? And friends, part of the answer to the question, does God care, is based on how we answer the question, who is Jesus? For you see, if Jesus is just a teacher or a spiritual leader, if he's just a voice for compassion or justice or love, then at the end of the day, he offers no real hope. For then sin is still sin. For then death is still death. The grave is still the grave, and evil still has the final word. But when we accept that Jesus is the resurrection, that Jesus is the life, then no matter how much our life feels like Good Friday, we know that Easter Sunday is coming. If we accept that Jesus is the resurrection and the life, then we accept that sin and death and suffering and despair, that none of this has the final word. God has the last word. The cross is the final word. The empty tomb is the final word. When we accept that Jesus is the resurrection and the life, that there is no situation that is so dark that it is beyond the redeeming light of God's love. And the question that Jesus asks of Martha is the same question that he asks of you and me. He simply says, do you believe this? And he's not talking about a belief which is just intellectual assent. He's talking about a belief which is a surrender of faith, an act of trust, a placing yourself in the loving arms of God. And so I invite you to do that right now. I will lead you in a prayer. And especially for those of you who find yourself in that place in which the circumstances of life, they lead you to ask, does God care? Why don't you just hear God pointing you beyond the circumstances of this life, to the reality of His cosmic plan for all of creation. Let us pray. As we move into prayer, I just to invite you to receive these words that Paul wrote in Romans 8. Paul writes, if we live to the Lord, and if we die for the Lord. So then, whether we live or die, we belong to the Lord. For this very reason, Christ died and returned to life, so that He might be the Lord of both the dead and the living. Oh God, we thank You that You are Lord of all creation. Thank You that You are the beginning and the end. And thank You that the circumstances of our life are not the end of it. For You have conquered death and sin and despair. And so as we become aware of You, the God who weeps with us, who is with us in our pain, we look beyond our circumstances to Your cosmic plan of redemption, to Your everlasting salvation. And we trust that You are enough, and that You will bring us through whatever valley we find ourselves in, to the mountaintop of Your love and Your grace, which conquers all. And for that we give You our thanks and praise, Lord God. Amen.